Welcome everyone to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link from our website, ICSSmarx.org, within the next few days. In pre-pandemic times, this weekly program was hosted at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, we've been meeting every Sunday on Zoom. In fact, we now have participants from not only the San Francisco Bay Area, but all over the US and even from around the world. So I'm going to wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. I would like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics, and speakers. You can sign up for email notifications for our meetings and contact us through our website at ICSSmarx.org. We've been running these programs Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library for over a decade and a half. We have programs on a variety of topics such as political economy of capitalism, socialism, communism, supporting the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism, militarism and war, the environmental movement, and the fight for racial and gender justice. We want to remind you that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. As such, we ask that you show respect to our participants and the moderator of today's session. Please note that the opinions expressed here are those of the speaker and participants. They do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Actually, very apropos for our speaker today, Carlos Garrido is a Cuban-American PhD student and instructor in the philosophy department at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He's the co-host of the popular Midwestern Marx YouTube channel. And his latest book, which we will be discussing today, is The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. Before we start, I just would like to remind you that Carlos was scheduled to speak at the end of last year, but almost had to cancel due to the birth of his son, Lucian. We've asked him, Carlos, for an update, and he's provided us. Let me just share my screen here for a moment. He's provided us with an update photograph of his son, who's now must be going on about 8 months, huh? Carlos?
Yes, a couple weeks away from 8 months. Yeah.
Wow, what a sweet looking kid. Congratulations. This is great.
Yes, he's phenomenal, very well behaved baby. A real joy to me, my wife, and my family's life.
That's terrific. Well, thank you. Welcome back, Carlos. We really appreciate your taking the time to speak to us today. And go ahead and take it away. We'll go for about half hour, 45 minutes maybe in presentation, take a short break for announcements, and then we'll have Q&A and discussion for the rest of the time until about 12:30. So Carlos, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for bringing me back on. I think that what you guys here at the ICSS and the Marxist Library are doing is very, very special. And the more of this that we could do, the better condition the left can have. So thanks again for bringing me on. As I mentioned before the recording started, I have a prepared presentation, but I'll also hope to give some comments on a recent phenomenon that has developed after I composed the presentation, which is the presidential announcement of Cornell West through the People's Party. So I'll try to tie in some of the ideas that I'm fleshing out in the presentation, which is related to the book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. I'll tie it to some of the reactions I've seen on the left and why the concept, I think, frankly, helps us understand some of the deficiencies of the left in the US and in Europe in general a little better. So, oops. In an 1875 letter to Wilhelm Brack, Marx would say that, quote, every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. This is the living spirit of Marxist analysis. The emphasis is laid on real struggles, on the forms of social formation these struggles discover in their overturning to a lesser or greater extent of the current state of things. This is the essence of one of the most central ways in which Marx and Engels formulate what communism is. As they say in the German ideology, quote, communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The purity fetish outlook which permeates Western Marxism is fundamentally antagonistic to this living and open Marxist worldview. It holds pure static ideas as sacred, and it rejects reality when such reality desecrates its pure ideals. This is the essence of the purity fetish outlook. It is an incessant passing of judgment grounded on a superficial assessment of whether reality measures up to pure ideals or not. Ideologically, it is deeply rooted in the traditions of Western philosophy, dating back at least to the Eleatic school 500 years before Christ. In this school, thinkers like Parmenides and Zeno would put forth the view that truth is unchanging, one, and indivisible. To accept change, contradiction, and a heterogeneous understanding of totality would be to participate in the way of falsity and opinion. With the exception of Heraclitus, Hegel, and Marxism, this form of thinking has dominated Western thought up to our day. And in the Western Marxists, it takes various distinctive forms which, while sustaining the appearance of Marxist analysis, is devoid completely of its revolutionary substance. The diagnosis Engels gave reductive Marxists in an 1890 letter to Conrad Schmidt applies fittingly to Western Marxists. He said, quote, what all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. When I first developed the concept of the purity fetish in October of 2021, there was primarily one form through which I observed it manifesting itself in Western Marxism. If there is a common thread found in the Western Marxist tradition, it is its unwavering rejection of socialist experiments, especially those led by communist parties. In the 1990s, following the overthrow of the Soviet Union, Michael Parenti had labeled them the adherents of pure socialism because they imagined, as he argued, quote, what socialism would be like in a world far better than this one, where no strong state structure or security force is required, where none of the value produced by workers needs to be expropriated to rebuild society and defend it from invasion and internal sabotage, end quote. Gabriel Rockhill has called their brand of critical theory ABS theory, as in anything but socialism. Their work in direct and also indirect forms ultimately leads to an acceptance of the capitalist order, since socialism is judged to be far worse. The Western Marxists ignore the constant hybrid warfare, as Vijay Prashad labels it, under which successful revolutionary projects have to construct socialism. They ignore the effects, especially for the experiments in the global South and East, that centuries of colonialism have had in keeping these areas poor and subjugated politically, economically, and culturally to the West. They ignore the colossal pressures, both historically inherited and contemporary, under which socialism is struggled for. And most importantly, they ignore how these pressures shape the parameters of embryonic socialist construction in these areas. As I argue in the book, socialism is not betrayed when encountering the external and internal pressures of imperialism and a national bourgeois class. It is forced to take more so-called authoritarian positions to protect the revolution. Socialism is not betrayed or transformed into state capitalism in the derogatory non-Leninist sense. When faced with a backwards economy, it takes the risk of tearing with its opposite and engages a process of opening up to foreign capital to develop its productive forces. The authoritarian moment or the moment of opening up to foreign capital are not an annihilating negation of socialism, as Western Marxists would have you believe, but the sublation, that is the overcoming of the idealistic conceptions of a pure socialism, especially in its earliest stages. A socialist Russia that had not taken the strategic retreat towards Lenin's new economic policy amidst the onslaught of the difficulties of war communism would have not survived. A war communism, of course, which was forced on them by the invasion after the revolution by 15 countries, including the UK, the US, Japan, Italy, and others. Likewise, without the so-called Stalinist collectivization, not only would the Soviet Union have remained unindustrialized and poor, but the Hitlerite forces would have been able to, as the West expected and, if we're frank, hoped, trample over the Judeo-Bolshevik menace, destroying the first worker state and the notion that working class people could, indeed, rule themselves. Similarly, a less authoritarian treatment of the Batista goons after the Cuban Revolution would have opened the window for imperialism and national counter-revolutionary forces to overthrow the popular revolution. A less authoritarian Democratic People's Republic of Korea would not have survived the hybrid warfare waged on it by the US empire and its NATO lackeys, who killed 20% of their population during the war and who have strangled their country with one of the most aggressive sanctions regimes in the world for 70 years straight. The authoritarianism that the Western Marxist purity fetish condemns is in every instance a necessary component to protect a revolution's sovereignty and socialist democracy. But since they treat authoritarianism and democracy abstractly, failing to ask the Leninist question, democracy for which class and authoritarianism against which class, they are unable to see the necessary role that authoritarianism against imperialism and against the national classes which collaborate with imperialism plays in securing a richer, broader, and more developed form of socialist democracy for the common people. The Western Marxist purity fetish makes them immune to seeing socialist construction as a process, one which will undoubtedly develop contradictions which will in time likely be overcome. A paradox arises in the Western Marxist sacrosanct abstract ideals. Namely, while real socialism is always too impure to obtain their support, these same Marxists won't hesitate to endorse directly or indirectly capitalist imperialism in its attempts to undermine both socialist experiments and non-socialist experiments that exist outside of US imperialism's sphere of influence. As Alan Freeman and Radhika Desai write in their recent dossier calling for a global anti-imperialist left, quote, "It no longer makes sense to describe the current Western left as left, since they are, at their core, partisans of Western imperialist states." This form of so-called Marxism, grounded on the purity fetish outlook, has been for decades an indispensable component of bourgeois hegemony. Their theorists' role as left-wing delegitimizers of socialist and anti-imperialist states has earned them the part of being the tambourines enhancing the tune of mainstream media's war drums. They are, as I've labeled them in the book, the agents of a controlled counter-hegemony, the radical recuperators, as Rockhill calls them, that absorb any and all dissenting attitudes in the masses into their compatible left, leaving capitalist imperialism fundamentally unchallenged. At its core, the purity fetish expresses a form of that which Georg Lukács called indirect apologetics. Their superficial repudiation of capitalism, when conjoined with their rejection of real socialism, is one of the most effective ways of affirming the dominant capitalist mode of life. They accept, at least in their practice, Churchill's dictum about capitalism being the worst system except for all the other ones. For them, bourgeois liberal democracy is, like the world Leibniz's God has created, the best of all possible worlds. This makes it the ideal form of controlled opposition, an opposition that buys fully into Thatcher's Tina, there is no alternative, and hence, whenever substantially opposed, the existing order, for it considers that the alternatives are far worse. As Keddy Shukrov describes it, their key function is in the, quote, radicalization of the impossibility of exit. As the general crises of capital are intensified by what John Bellamy Foster has called the two forms of exterminism, namely nuclear war and the planetary ecological emergency, it becomes indispensable for Marxists to struggle against this purity fetish outlook. It is a worldview which not only obstructs the acquisition of truth, but vacillates from being simply revolutionary futile to being an indispensable material and ideological force for the conservation of the dominant order. In the US, the purity fetish takes an additional two forms, which I would like to briefly bring up. In each case, again, it prevents the acquisition of truth and the development of a revolutionary movement. There is a strong current on the left, both in social democrat and in communist spaces, that views the Trump voting part of the working class as constituting a fascist threat. These workers are seen as a contaminated basket of deplorables, in the words of Comrade Hillary Clinton, who are unfit to be organized. As someone who has spent their whole organizing life in the Midwest, the area of the country most densely populated with pro-Trump workers, these sentiments are far from true. But even if they were, even if it was the case that the most backward part of the working class, even if it was the case that this was the most backward part of the working class, what is the point of communists if not precisely to lift the consciousness of workers, regardless of their ideological starting point? Would we not just be preaching to the choir if we expected the working class to already meet all the pure standards of our enlightened social consciousness? The task of communists is to organize along class lines, not ideological lines, and to raise the consciousness of workers, regardless of their ideological starting point, to socialist class consciousness. As Gramsci would put it, the task of communists is to find the kernels in the masses' incoherent worldview, which could be re-articulated towards socialism. Patronizing attitude towards the masses makes this task impossible. One must learn from the masses in order to guide them towards socialism. The educator, as Marx noted very early on, must himself be educated. If the purity fetish leads one to reject organizing the 40% or so of workers which voted for Trump, this paralyzes the class struggle at a time when conditions couldn't be riper for its development. If this is true of those on the ultra-left who cancel the Trump part of the working class because it fails to meet their pure standards of what enlightened social consciousness workers must have before being organized, it couldn't be more truer of those fringe elements which see all non-indigenous workers as settlers. And believe me, this is unfortunately a growing tendency in the communist left. The second unique form the purity fetish takes in the American Marxists can be found in their assessment of their national past. The dialectical worldview, both in Hegel and in Marxism, rejects the idea of an unchanging, pure, ahistorical universal, and instead urges that universals are necessarily tied to historically conditioned concrete particulars. Universals are always concrete, that is, they exist and take their form through the particular. What does this tell us about socialism? Well, simply that there's no such thing as abstract socialism. Socialism is a universal which cannot exist unless concretized through the particular. In every country it has taken root in, socialism has had to adapt itself to the unique characteristics of the peoples that have waged and won the struggle for political power. In China, this has taken the form of socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Cuba, this has meant incorporating José Martí and the anti-colonial traditions into socialist construction. In Venezuela, this has taken the form of Bolivarian socialism. In the plurinational state of Bolivia, this has taken the form of combining Marxism with the indigenous communist traditions which have been around for centuries. In the continent of Africa, this has taken the form of Pan-African socialism, and so on. In each case, the struggle has been, as Georgy Dmitriev had already noted in 1935, national in form and socialist in content. In various parts of the US left, the purity fetish outlook has obscured this historical lesson. It made rampant the phenomenon which Dmitriev called national nihilism. Our people's history is reduced to slavery, settler colonialism, imperialism, and all the evils of capitalism, capital, and the state. In doing so, they reject drawing from their national past to give form to socialist content. Far from the progressivism they see in this, what this actually depicts is a liberal-tinted American exceptionalism, which thinks that the struggle for socialism in the US will itself not have to follow this concrete universal tendency seen around the world, where socialism functions as the content that takes form, that is concretizes, according to the unique circumstances in which it is being developed. In other words, this is a form of exceptionism. The US is the exception. Everywhere else in the world, this has to be done, but the US doesn't have to do that. We're too impure to do that. This has prevented the US left from genuinely learning from its progressive history and connecting with its people. It makes impossible the task of rearticulating the kernels of progressive thought in our people's common sense towards socialism. It prevents the American Marxists from understanding their national past dialectically, as a social totality in constant movement propelled by its internal objective contradictions. Because our national past is impure, the purity fetish Marxists make the task of learning from our progressive struggles, from Douglas to Du Bois to Henry Winston, impossible. These figures and the movements they were attached to are held to be, in a form of left-wing McCarthyism, anti-American. The anti-communist myth we fought against last century has been accepted in this one, namely that America and the American people are on one side and socialism on the other, with an unbridgeable gap in the middle. The acceptance of this McCarthyite nonsense has been thanks to the development of the purity fetish within a greatly debilitated communist movement that was left wandering in the dark after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. But times have changed, and so can we. Today, the younger generations of Americans face, for the first time in US history, living standards worse than their parents. As 60,000 people continue to die a year because they do not have health insurance, as 60% of Americans are a lost paycheck away from joining the 600,000 homeless people wandering around in a country with 33 times as many empty homes as homeless people, as 34 million Americans, including 1 in 8 children, experience hunger in a country which throws away 40% of its food supply, as stagnant wages and inflation have working class Americans struggling to make ends meet, as failed proxy wars and global de-dollarization kicks in, demonstrating with undoubtable clarity the moribund character of US capitalist imperialism, as, in short, it becomes clear that neither the people nor the ruling class can continue in the old way, signifying the objective revolutionary conditions of our historical moment. The purity fetish today stands as the primary barrier preventing the development of the subjective conditions for a revolutionary movement. We must overcome the purity fetish outlook before it obliterates our ability to overthrow, in a timely manner, our demented ruling class that is pushing the world to the precipice of nuclear Armageddon in the name of sustaining its global hegemony. These enemies of humanity are wobbling, but as Lenin said, they will never fall if not toppled over. Thank you. That's my presentation, and I wanted to connect this real quick with the Cornell West situation. As I'm sure most of you know, a few days ago, Cornell West announced his bid for presidency through the People's Party. I think this is a historical bid, primarily because he embodies the Bernie movement. He was a leading surrogate of the Bernie movement, and this People's Party is a formation that came out of the disappointment of 2016, when Bernie endorsed Hillary Clinton instead of making his bid as an independent or making his bid through some other third party, the Green Party or whatever. This party was created so that Bernie could have a vessel to carry forth the movement that he was calling a political revolution, but outside the Democratic Party, which, as we know, is the place where movements go to die. They get absorbed always into the capitalist imperialist fold. So I think this run by Cornell West is historic in that sense, where Bernie created this moment that brought many people, especially young people who see in front of them a futureless future. It brought many young people to the idea that socialism is a viable alternative. Now, that socialism, of course, is not the same one that Marxist-Leninists are thinking of, but it's definitely a progressive move in a country that has been for so long indoctrinated by McCarthyite anti-communist propaganda. And today we have polls that say that more than half of young Americans see socialism favorably, and less than half of them see capitalism favorably. That means that we have a tremendous potential for revolution in the coming decades if we're able to, work with these young individuals, of which I am myself a part of. So Bernie demonstrated while moving the struggle for socialism and the class struggle forward, he also showed the limits of a specific form of social democracy that's tied to the Democratic Party. And so there's these objective contradictions that we have with Bernie, where on the one hand, it's a progressive socialist advancement of the class struggle as we haven't seen at least in the electoral realm, in maybe 100 years, perhaps a little more in the US. But on the other hand, it had very visible limitations. And a lot of the people that were involved in that movement were able to see those objective contradictions. And part of what our institute, the Midwestern Marxist Institute, has been trying to figure out is how can we have a sublation of Bernie? So how can we take the rational kernels in Bernie, which brought tens of millions of Americans into the political process, which made active tens of millions of young people like us that knocked on thousands of doors in, negative 10-degree Iowa weather, or 10-degree Iowa weather, speaking to thousands of working class individuals. How can we get the rational kernels of that movement, remove the bad parts, the pro-imperialist stances, the folding to the Democratic Party, et cetera, and sublate the Bernie movement, right? And I think that the Cornell West move is part of that process of overcoming the Bernie moment. And the fact that he's running through a third party, the People's Party, is extremely significant, because that means that it has already heeded to actualizing what many people saw as one of the key limitations in the Bernie Sanders run, which was that he was attached to the Democratic Party. Now, I don't think that the answer to our current dilemmas, which are all rooted in capitalism, is simply running through a third party platform. I am, a communist, a Marxist-Leninist. I understand that all these issues are tied to the fact that we exist under a dictatorship of capital, and without the complete overhaul of this system and its replacement by proletarian institutions that serve the interests of labor and not the interests of capital, we're not going to get to where we would like to get, which I think where we would like to get, at least in terms of ideals, Cornell agrees with us somewhat. But it is nonetheless a step forward in the class struggle, because even if he fails, and we're hoping he wins, and we want to act as if he will win, because that would help us advance the struggle more. But even if Cornell fails, the same way that the failures in Bernie showed people the limitations of that form of DNC-rooted Justice Democrats' approach to the class struggle, it's going to help people realize that, the panacea of our current age is not simply running third party. We need something more radical. We need vanguard parties that are entrenched in working class communities, that are embedded in the most militant sectors of organized labor, that are embedded in people's communities, and that can have a project not to simply take over certain positions within the capitalist state, but figure out how to overcome the capitalist state itself, which is, I think, very clearly showing its signs of its moribund character. Nonetheless, I think the Cornell's run is very positive. And from the reactions which we have seen from a large part of the left in the US, I think the purity fetish is perhaps the best concept we have to describe what we've seen. I think the most general rejection that I've seen from the left that calls itself socialist and communist has been one that's grounded on the party that Cornell is running through, the People's Party. The argument is that the leader of this party, Nick Brana, had a sexual assault case with one of the fellow workers of the party. And there was also, allegedly a mismanagement of funds and donations to the party on on behalf of Brana and his father. Those are the arguments that people are making, which then they extend towards the argument, which I think is grounded in the purity fetish, that the party is too impure. We love Cornell West. We think a third party run is excellent. But why the People's Party? This party is so impure. Why are you going to throw your lot through this impure party? And I think the paradox here is that many of these same people wouldn't have a problem throwing their lot or their vote with the Democratic Party. And here you have what I mentioned in the book. I have a section called The Paradoxes of the Purity Fetish, which is that any progressive class struggle, any progressive movement, any anti-imperialist or socialist state that's, trying to construct an alternative order abroad, those are always too impure to support. But somehow it is capitalist imperialism, specifically in its liberal forms, and its more what some people have called woke, and its woke forms, that is always never impure enough to support. And I think you're seeing it here very clearly with Cornell's presidential bid and the reaction of the left. A lot of them have said that they like Cornell very much. They would like to support him, but they can't support him because of the party. The party is a non-starter. That's one of the arguments that I've seen. And I would say, it's if you want a more impure party, a party that, as capitalism does, as Marx argued that capitalism does, comes dripping from head to foot in blood and dirt, just look at the Democrats and the Republicans, right? There's no more impure party than that. The other argument I've seen connected to the critique of Cornell West has been one that I think is generally correct. It comes from a part of the left, which I align myself with, the Marxist-Leninist left, which is critical of his positions with regard specifically to the US and NATO-led proxy war against Russia, and with regard to China. In a recent Democracy Now! Interview, Cornell West described both Russia and China as empires. And that's extremely unfortunate. And of course, we disagree with that wholeheartedly. And we think that when those points are brought up within the campaign, we should be there to criticize them in a comradely manner and show them the correct way, such as he's touted this lie that has even been confirmed as a lie by mainstream media, that there's anything like a Uyghur genocide in China. Even mainstream media dropped the idea that this was going on. First, they said, no, it's not an actual genocide, it's a cultural genocide. And then pretty soon they said, yeah, it was kind of bullshit. And we were kind of lying about it the whole time. But he's touting this thing. So all of these issues, I think, are objective contradictions that are contained within Cornell's run, that we shouldn't gloss over them or whitewash them. We should see them for what they are. And if we can play a role within his campaign to have him change those positions, we should. But either way, I think that the substance of his positions in those areas are still leaps and bounds ahead of the alternatives, because it's grounded in the fact that even though he has this erroneous view of China and Russia being empires, he still doesn't want war. He's against war, and he's against intervention, and he says that he's very much against the proxy war, and at least he understands Russia's special military operations, which he calls an invasion. He understands it in terms of NATO expansion eastward. He doesn't mention the 2014 coup, which is unfortunate, but he sees that there's a context and a series of factors which led to the fact of the special military operations, which is already leaps and bounds ahead, as I said, of the DNC and the mainstream line of the Republican Party. I wouldn't say maybe Trump, because parts of Trump's rhetoric perhaps are more advanced with regards to that issue than Cornell West. Some of RFK's rhetoric on the proxy war has also been perhaps more advanced, but I think undoubtedly Cornell West is a tremendous step forward in the class struggle. I think we should support it. Perhaps join the ranks of the campaign, see where we can help him overcome some of those contradictions, and use this opportunity to raise the class consciousness of our people in ways in which we wouldn't be able to do at this level, this quick, without that run. And just one example of this, one of the co-directors at our institute, Noah Krashevich, he was able to put out an article defending, from a Marxist-Leninist point of view, Cornell West's run in Newsweek. This is a massive newspaper. On Twitter, for instance, they have 3.5 million followers. He was able to make an argument from a Marxist-Leninist point of view to an audience that would have never heard that. And that's sort of been the result of our involvement early on with this campaign. And there's so much more potential to this development. So it's grounded, I think, in the purity fetish, the left's rejection to seeing what we can get out of this campaign, out of this run in terms of advancing the class struggle and the struggle for socialism. Sorry for the rant. That last part was impromptu. I didn't have any section prepared on it, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts both on the presentation and on Cornell's run and on other things as well.
Thank you, Carlos. We're going to take a quick break for announcements. Before we do, I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have a Q&A session following the announcements. You can participate by clicking on the reactions button on the lower part of your screen and raising your hand, and we'll take questions in order as best we can for the rest of the time and have some good discussion. A lot of topics were raised during Carlos's presentation. So before we go on, I just wanted to let you know that we have some upcoming sessions. Next week, we have Rahul Varman, who's going to be talking about, the title of his talk is Indian Telecom's Spectacular Rise in the Nature of Monopoly Capital in India. Raj, if you want to say a word or two about his presentation, I think that would be appreciated.
Sure. Literally everybody has a cell phone in India today, no matter how poor or rich. And this is a transformation that has occurred in the last 3 decades. And yet, it is also associated with rise of monopoly capital and its links with global monopoly capital. So Rahul Varman is a friend of mine. He's younger to me. And he is a professor at the institute where I graduated from in India. And he is not just a professor, he's very active in organizing the contract workers, which are the most exploited. And I have worked with him in the last decade. I think he has published at least one article I've read in Monthly Review, and his would be a very thoughtful presentation. The monopoly capital is I believe we are in the monopoly stage of capital once again in a different way than it was in 1916. So I think it'll be a very exciting and informative session.
Thank you, Raj. The following week on June 25th, we will be having Danny Shaw, who is active in the Haiti support movement. He'll be speaking on Haiti and anti-imperialist perspective. He's spoken here at the library before, and it should be very informative. A lot of developments in Haiti. And then on July 9th, we have another speaker, Simone Chun from the Korea Policy Institute. Will be talking about recent events on the Korean Peninsula and American imperialism in Korea. So we have some good sessions lined up. Those of you who wish to receive email notifications should go to our website at ICSSmarx.org. You can sign up. There's a pop-up that comes up. You will receive, fill it out, submit it. You'll receive an email notification every week of upcoming programs. You can also check out the videos from past presentations. We have quite a few of them up there right now. They're on our YouTube channel, ICSS Marx. But if you want to get the notifications, sign up, and we will send you the notifications. Also, you can contact us through the contact form on the website. So with that, we'll go over, we have quite a few people have raised their hands. We'll go over to the Q&A part of the presentation. And I'm going to start with Norma, followed by Richard Wright, followed by Yusuf. So Norma, if you would Whoops, let me just allow participants to unmute themselves. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Norma, and ask your question.
Hi, hello, everyone. I think that this presentation was gotten by the group because I said so. I've been telling this to people for a long time, what you said, and greetings and thank you. I have an interest in looking at the term worker because so many people don't get that they are workers as compared to the people who benefit off of our work. And they're marginalized and made outsiders in society relative to the word worker. I wonder if you might think that there is another way of addressing the mass populace than by having to keep saying worker when we mean everybody else besides the profiteers, besides the owners and the individuals committed to that formation in some way that basically excludes them from ever joining with us.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a very, very good question, and something we've tried to address a few times on stream because, you know, one of the parts of the analysis that I provide in the book, which I leave out in the presentation, is the class position of where this purity fetish predominates and where other unhelpful tendencies in the left predominates. And I argue that, you know, for the last few decades at least, a good chunk of the left and the organizations on the left, whether they consider themselves democratic socialists or communists, they're embedded in the forms of relationality that are archetypical to what's been called the professional managerial class. For a while, sometimes people have referred to it just shortly as the middle class, which is a looser statement. You know, it's not a scientific statement, it's a bourgeois classification, but it can serve its role, I think. In the old school Marxist-Leninist tradition, we just called it forms of petty bourgeois radicalism. That's what Gus Hall, he's got a very good article called On Petty Bourgeois Radicalism, which one of our editors, Noah Krashvik, updated it in the recent Journal of American Social Studies to an understanding of today and the middle classes and the professional managerial classes. So I do think that, you know, our analysis should be grounded in the dynamics that shape the forms of intercourse that we exist in, the material relations between people. And I think that there is, so when Marx is describing the working class, the first determination that makes the working class is the fact that it has nothing to sell in the market besides its labor power. And a big chunk of the American population, the vast majority of people, are in that position where all they can sell is their labor power, either for a salary or a wage in order to survive. And then there's a small group that because they own, they don't have to do that, right? And it's tempting to say, okay, this big group is the proletariat, the working class, and this other group is the bourgeoisie. And to some extent that is correct, but Marx also develops his class analysis much further. And if that understanding of working class as all you have to sell is your labor power, that's what I would call the most abstract understanding. You can then develop a more concrete understanding from there. He talks about, you know, the industrial working class, the agricultural working class, the non-productive parts of the working class. He even talks about service worker. He talks about managerial workers. So he has a very complex and concrete class analysis that takes account of the nuances within this mass of laborers. And I think we should have that, right? We should be clear what sections of this working mass are the ones that are producing the vast majority of surplus value, and we should sustain the scientific rigor that's archetypical of Marxism in that sense. We should also have approaches that are cognizant of the fact that, you know, it's not simply the industrial proletariat that needs to be involved in a working class movement or other producing classes. It needs to be this mass of and sometimes I just refer to it as the people versus the elite or the rulers or the capitalists, imperialists. And we need to be able to do that, but I don't think we should lose sight of this more rigorous analysis of, what section of the working class is the one that's exploited the most, what forms of consciousness arise in the stratum of the working class that people have often called the professional managerial class. How are those forms of consciousness rooted in institutions, which I've called before the iron triangle of the media, the NGOs, and the academy? For instance, Noah, who I've referenced for some reason 3 times, he's a working class guy, a carpenter. He's in the party, and he's convinced all of his coworkers about communism. And they ask him, well, why don't you bring them to party meetings? And he can't, because he knows that as soon as they get there, they'll be, they will find unappealing the forms of relations, off-put, the forms of intercourse that are in party meetings, because they're dominated by this form of relationality that's archetypical of the academy. It makes it feel, as he said a few times, as a human resource meeting or as a diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting, which is very bourgeois and off-putting for a good chunk of this other part of the working class. So
let me give you another line about why I think this. I run for office for the school board in Berkeley, and I'm never going to get elected because I preach all this stuff, which is why I run. And I want the 2-year-old child to feel that they're included as a worker. All of them, everybody. I want, of course, the people in prison have a difficult understanding of their position. So I'm looking for everybody. I'm a 90-year-old person who does all kinds of things and could want to put in an hour or 2 or 100 a week, however much they feel like it and are able. I want people to volunteer to work as it is and to be of all the various segments of society.
Yeah, I agree. If we have to go broad, especially in terms of the political struggles, but we should still, I think, hold some form of scientific rigor in our class.
I agree. I agree with every word you said, and effectively been coming out of my mouth for the past over a year, ever since the Russian, the Russian further attack by the Imperium against the Bolshevik Revolution,
Okay, next is Richard, followed by Yusuf, followed by Jean. So Richard, if you would unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Carlos, it was a very nice presentation. I appreciate the presentation. I wasn't aware that you were with this Midwestern Marx Institute, which my friend Hobie has suggested I go visit, and I will more often. I have sort of 2 questions that are seemingly, well, to my mind, they're sort of connected. I'm not sure exactly how, but they're sort of connected. I was at the Labor Notes conference last year up in Chicago. And yesterday I spent my day at a Labor Notes workshop for about 9 hours. And there were a lot of there were a lot of like DSA liberal Democrats there, but there are still also a lot of what I think are anarchist, labor union people. Admittedly, they may be young, I'm not sure, but there's nevertheless an element out there of just overthrow capitalism, period, with very little, if any, analysis that I can speak of. I was wondering if maybe you can address that. The other issue, and like I said, I think this is somehow related, is there's also a movement out there of the that I think takes its thoughts from Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and that is the a nonviolent protests against nonviolent protests. I guess I'll just leave it there. I was wondering if maybe, and then to me they seem to be related. So I was just wondering if maybe you can make comments on those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think those are very good questions, and I think you're right to see that perhaps there's an interconnection of sorts. Just real quick, by the way, to reply to Norma, there's a distinction that we've made for a very long time in the Marxist-Leninist tradition between the working mass or the toiling mass and the working class. Stalin uses working mass. William C. Foster here in the U.S. uses toiling mass. I think that might be a helpful distinction. But to get back to Richard's question, yeah, I've
I'm sorry, what word did you say? What kind of mass?
toiling mass and working mass.
Thank you, yeah.
To get back to Richard's questions, I've seen part of the development of this labor notes project somewhat favorably. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's led by Trotskyites and certain elements within the DSA, which of course we have disagreements with, or I had disagreements with. But I think in general, it's helping to play a part in making the labor movement a little bit more militant, which has been something that we've had lacking ever since the leading trade unions were forced to kick out the communists, which I know that this is a topic that Greg Goddles touched very nicely on, I think, in the last ICSS presentation in one of the questions. So I think that they're playing a role in creating like the events that I think it was last year where they had Sean O'Brien, the new president of the Teamsters, which is a more militant president, as well as Chris Smalls and others. And I think it's playing generally a favorable.
Yeah, you're correct on that. You're correct on that. Yeah.
Obviously, it's got some things that are somewhat incoherent, some understandings of the struggle against capitalism, which are perhaps abstract, such as the anarchistic tendencies which you mentioned, which put forth, what we'd call an abstract negation, just tear the system down really, and it doesn't really put forth a way towards doing that or a replacement of what's being torn down, right? Because we don't just want to tear things down. We want to construct new things that are better, qualitatively better and different from the things that are up now. That's the purpose of tearing down, not just tearing down for its own sake. That's a very, I think at least somewhat infantile attitude. And it reminds me of like when teenagers start rebelling against their parents, which I guess I'll experience for myself in a decade or so. But yeah, I think it's generally a positive thing. The most positive thing that I've seen within the labor movement, I think it's the Chris Smalls development with the Amazon Labor Union, connected to that, the other unions, the Starbucks Workers United, which is somewhat working conjointly with the AOU. And Smalls just took a trip to Cuba, came back, declared himself a revolutionary. He's put out in various tweets comments about not supporting the Democratic Party or Biden. And this is huge for a labor leader that, is coming out in Times list of the 100 most influential people in the country. It's pretty big, especially when we have a tradition of the last 60 years or so where labor has kind of just gone on board with US imperialism and have fought here and there for somewhat immediate crumbs, but not really has kept the interest of the long-term interest of the working class at heart. And I think that's central to what communists should be doing. We should be going to those unions where the vast majority of workers are in, which are not many, because the unionization is like at 5 to 7%. And what's often not talked about is what percentage of that is people that are active. It's a very low percent from what I have read and spoken with union members. But we should be in those spaces organizing as well and not have a purity fetish that prevents us from working with them just because they're trots or DSA people or anarchists. Yeah, so that would be my reply to that. And then the nonviolent protest, somewhat the same thing. There's been some more abstract protests against the war. have an analysis that I don't think it's just a inter-imperialist conflict. I disagree with that narrative. I think the working class has its lot in the victory of one side, and the conditions for the possibility of their victory are very modest. I think what Russia has been demanding is simply to not have Ukraine join NATO and to not violate red lines which have been set for decades. In many ways, these are demands that the leading forces that have been making them in Russia has been the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is the inheritor of Lenin's party. So I do think that the working class has a side in this conflict, but I do think we should work that into a peace movement, a call for peace. And I think peace is only going to come about if we remove the interests which have, one, led to this war, and two, proliferated it. Because Ukraine and Russia have tried to sit down a couple times before, and it's been the US and NATO forces which have prevented any sort of peace talks between the two countries. So I think our focus should be primarily on the US and NATO, the funding of Nazis, neo-Nazis in Ukraine, the role that those neo-Nazis are playing in the Ukrainian armed forces in their fights against Russia, in their murders of the people in Donbass, which have recently stopped ever since the Russian special military operations. We talked a few days ago with Dan Kovalik, who just came back last year from, he visited, I believe it was Donetsk. He was telling us stories about, how happy the people in that area are after the special military operations. Their homes are not getting shelled in the same rates that they were before. And as soon as Russia came in, the first flag they put up was not the Russian or the flag of Donetsk. It was the Soviet flag, the red flag, which is flying all over the place. So I think the working class has a side in the conflict, but I think we should ask for peace, because it's very scary what the imperialist forces are escalating humanity into, which is mutual destruction. We should fight against that.
Okay, next is Yusuf, followed by Jean, followed by Raj. So Yusuf, if you would go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. But many of the things you say, I would agree with. I'm not, don't know the People's Party all that well, but I'm sort of take a less enthusiastic view, but that's a side, that's not my issue. I was rather surprised at your talk when you said pure, when the title was Purity Fetish. That usually refers to ultra-leftism in the discourse of pre-war, between World War I and World War II. There were accusations of ultra-leftism both by Trotsky and Stalin. But what the purity you seem to talk about is a non-Marxist standards set by some European theorists, borrowing from utopian socialism. They call it libertarian socialism, radical democracy, or something else. And it's generally a non-Marxist. It's a step away from the bread and butter issues of the economic-based issues of Marxism. So I'm rather surprised, and maybe you could put some clarity and maybe explain your discourse to me a little more.
Yes, thank you very much. And I agree that that every time I call them Marxists in the book, I do it with quotation marks. Because really, if they first, what I see the purity fetish as is fundamentally an absence of a dialectical materialist worldview, right? Which that's synonymous with saying it's an absence of Marxism, because I see Marxism as a worldview and the worldview is dialectical materialism. They are unable to see contradictions in things, right? And the example of the US is perfect. They can't see the US as a social totality that has contradictions, that has an ugly history and it has a positive history. And we should know how to exploit this contradiction to our benefit, get the positive side, and re-articulate it to socialism. They're unable to see things in movement, right? There's a recent tendency in the left that, for instance, when they talk about the US, they refer to it as a settler colonial state. They're not able to realize how it is that, yeah, that might have been the case in the 1700s. You know, there's been a quantitative development and various qualitative leaps that have came about in the development of the US as a social totality. And the stage that we're in of capitalism today is not this embryonic stage of settler colonialism, but we're in the monopoly stage of capitalism. In other words, we're in the imperialist stage of capitalism, and we don't have settlers, we have workers. They're unable to see the US as a social totality, its movements, its objective contradictions. They're unable to see things in interconnection, right? So they expect socialism to just develop purely as if it was existing in a void and not interconnected and embedded within a world still dominated by global capitalist imperialism. So fundamentally, right, I agree that we should even bring into question, should we even call these people Marxists? And I do that through, you know, putting quotation marks as, you know, these Marxists. But their outlook, the purity fetish outlook, is an incessant obsession with passing judgment that supports that which is pure. That which is pure, whether it's the idea of a pure working class, the idea of a pure national past, or a pure party, or a pure socialist construction. If purity is not measured up to by reality, reality itself is tossed aside. And that's completely antithetical to the Marxist worldview, which is centered on an understanding of the real movement of history, on looking at material reality and prioritizing material, real struggles over abstract, doctrinaire, pure ideals. So that's, I think you're absolutely right in questioning whether that's, whether they're Marxists in doing that. And as to the question of right opportunism and left, or left anti-communism, I would add right opportunism. I see the purity fetish as the ideological ground, the worldview out of which both right opportunism and left anti-communism stem. And out of the three central flaws that I see the purity fetish manifesting itself in the US, in the book, I go over which ones are primarily seen in the right opportunists, which ones are primarily seen in the ultra-leftists. And I describe each of those as manifestations of the same thing. And I think part of the central importance, I think, of the purity fetish is that it allows you to not see these different flaws of the left as interconnected things, as disconnected things. It allows you to see them in their interconnection and how they are all rooted in a fundamentally anti-Marxist purity fetish worldview. And that makes the battle of critiquing them and searching for ideological clarity much easier when you see that it's not just separate things, but all of their worldviews, all of their positions are different forms that the same worldview is taking. And that worldview I have labeled as the purity fetish.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next is Jean, followed by Raj, followed by Janet, then Eric. So Jean, if you would go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Carlos. I really appreciate your presentation and your grasp of Marxist-Leninist theory and all. I think if I looked hard enough, I could find some things to quibble with. But overall, I'm really impressed by your grasp of theory and also all the work you're doing there. And I also want to just note that I have 8 grandkids. And so I really appreciate when young people are willing to take on the responsibility of actually raising the next generation. Engels says that, Marx has always stressed that's the production and reproduction of real life. And I think that's a big responsibility. And thank you for taking that on. And there are a lot of things that I appreciate. One is, again, your stress on socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's been kind of like a hobby horse of mine. And people, if they look at Mao's picture, they will understand that Mao had Chinese characteristics. And the socialism with Chinese characteristics goes back there. And there's so much that has been accomplished by the Chinese working class under with the guidance and support of the Communist Party of China. So I just wanted to make that point. The other thing I just wanted to mention, I have some issues about Cornell West and his position, and again, dealing with the his idea that China and Russia are new empires. So there's that. But, you know, here in California, we do have the Peace and Freedom Party, which is a socialist, feminist, anti-war party that has existed since 1967. I ran as a candidate for Congress a couple of times with them, but we do have a party here in California that will be running a socialist candidate, Gloria La Riva, Party for Socialism and Liberation, who are centered across the Bay and in New York. But I just wanted to say that about you know, what's going on in the United States. I've been directed not to bring my Settle for Biden cup to meetings, but I just want to say that, you know, we have a real threat of fascism here in the United States, and that is done under the Donald Trump. And he's been a disaster. If you look at his Supreme Court nominees, everything else he's done, he's really a bad news. So I just wanted to say that and get your comments on the upcoming election and also the threat of fascism here in the United States. So, but again, thank you for all the work you're doing. It's really great. And thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for the question, Gene. Yeah, you mentioned the first thing you mentioned was about having kids and the importance of young people having kids, and you mentioned productive and reproductive labor, and that's something that we cannot forget. You know how much work is done in the household, primarily done by women that's fully unpaid, and that's you know, if we're going to talk about working class, Norma brought up a good question at the beginning. How do we think about working class? I think that's something that we cannot lose sight of. Our friend of the Institute Radical Messiah, she's done very good work in that area, and you know, seeing the role of reproductive labor as a form of labor and the people that do it as workers. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And yeah, having a kid adds a new dimension to the struggle, because it's not just a future that I have no connection to. That I'm fighting for, that I might die and then, you know, whatever, let the world burn. But, you know, there's a part of me that lingers on after I'm gone. And hopefully that part develops its own part, et cetera, et cetera. So it connects you to future generations in ways in which, you know, I think if you don't have a kid, sometimes you can't be connected to it. So that's something that I've experienced, at least personally. Yeah, I definitely agree. As I mentioned, I think all countries, and you know, I'm just repeating here, Dimitrov, all countries are going to have to give the socialist content a national form, and socialism with Chinese characteristics. I think it's a fun, it's a great name for doing that. You know, maybe we can flirt with socialism with American characteristics, or American socialism, or American Marxism, etc. But you know, some places don't even have a term for it; they just do it naturally, like Cuba. Cuba doesn't call their socialism, you know, socialism with Marti characteristics, etc. But you see very clearly that they're grounding their development of socialism on a view that doesn't lose sight of their past and their anti-colonial struggles in the past, and Mambi and Marti and other central figures. As far as La Riva, I didn't know that she was running again. I voted for La Riva in 2020 in the general election, and I generally have been very supportive of the PSL's run as a Marxist party for presidency. However, I think that although she has doubled her voters each time she's ran, and that's been a very impressive development, I think that we can skip a whole lot of steps with Cornell West, who maybe not a household name, but the closest thing that we can have to a self-proclaimed Christian socialist being a household name. And I'm obviously very troubled by his positions with regard to Russia and China, but I think that the substance of them is a non-interventionism, which is still very positive in light of what other options we have with the Democrats and the Republicans, even those Republicans like Trump that are trying to postulate themselves as peace candidates. But, you know, he did the same thing the last time he ran, and the 4 years that he was president for, there was nothing of peace. You know, raised sanctions against Venezuela, killed Soleimani, almost brought us to a third world war with his activities in Iran, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many other examples. Brought back the full-scale blockade against Cuba. So there was nothing of peace in his presidency, I think. Or if there was, it was very incoherent and inconsistent, and largely probably rooted in some incapacities than in any general principle. I do think there's a fascist threat. I wouldn't say that it's simply rooted in the Republican Party. I think fascism is always lurking when capitalism enters in crisis. I think it's the face of capitalism that comes out when the hegemonic apparatus, when consent isn't easily attainable in the mass populace, and we're getting to somewhere near that. The vast majority of Americans are discontented by the duopoly of the Republicans and the Democrats. I think statistics are showing that only 20% of the population thinks that Congress actually represents them. That means that 80% of the people feel unrepresented in our current political systems. And I think fascism is coming from both parties. What we saw in the fighting back against the real workers' democratic right to strike, something that was done by Biden earlier this year, illegalizing their capacity to strike, funding repressive policing, while at the same time he was elected during this big Black Lives Matter uprising, where the Democratic Party posited itself as the party that was going to change, give some small reforms, some handouts to the Black Lives Matter movements. So besides the fact that, you know, his party is the one that's leading the effort in giving $150 billion to Nazis in Ukraine, actual Nazis, people with swastika tattoos and SS tattoos, and some of them have full portraits of Hitler on their back. So I find it very difficult to think about the party that is giving hundreds of billions of dollars to Nazis as in any way, shape, or form playing the role of a vehicle to fight fascism at home. I think that both of them are open to fascism just because of the general role that fascism plays within capitalism as a necessary mechanism of it that comes about in times of crisis when the working class is fighting back, and that plays the role of, you know, as Dimitrov would say, the most reactionary, backwards elements of monopoly capital. And we're seeing those fight backs against democratic rights from, I think, both parties, not just the Republicans. So I think to beat that fascist threat, we can't go the route of the maybe a little bit less openly fascist party that, you know, as we saw with the midterms, they've given tens of millions of dollars to the most right-wing parts of the Republican Party. Right? So, you know, to have an idea that to beat the fascist threat, you have to support the party that's given tens of millions of dollars to the fascist threat at home, and that's given hundreds of billions of dollars to Nazis abroad. I find that kind of difficult. I think we have to create alternative socialist workers' parties, and that's the only way we're going to be able to actually beat the fascist threat.
Yeah. Could I also, just as you were talking, the other thing that concerns me and many people is, you know, the increasing repression against the LGBTQ community. I mean, that's gained new life. And also the anti-abortion, you know, which is very strongly tied into Republican candidates. Every candidate is really bad on this. And you know, what the Democrats are not as bad on this, at least in terms of both the abortion rights for women and also LGBTQ people. So maybe you could.
I agree, but they feed off of giving the more right-wing conservative forces in the country an open lane to doing those things, because then they could just tell people vote for us because we're better on these issues, when they had, you know, more than 30 years to ratify Roe v. Wade, and they didn't, right? They don't actually care about these democratic rights of working people at large. They just want to use them in the best way they can in order to paint themselves as superior to the Republic. At least that's my view. If they actually cared about these democratic rights, they they would have protected them in ways in which they could have, but didn't. They left it open for what they're now painting as a fascist threat that I think that they're complicit in.
Okay. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Raj, if you would go ahead.
Okay. Am I on? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Carlos, thank you very much. I haven't read your book so far. I intend to read it, but I haven't had a chance to read it. I also totally agree with you that we have to keep an attitude that development of opposition to both major political parties is a healthy development. And despite Cornell West's problematic remark on China and Russia, which I strongly disagree with you, I agree with you that they are not imperialists. Okay. Now, so I have a question on monopoly capitalism. A monopoly stage, according to Lenin, is the stage of rottenness of capitalism. In other words, capitalism has lost its vitality by and large, and wants to now, it is facing difficulty with continuing making profit through capitalism. So it develops into a moribund state of economy, and then it uses other means to break through it. And fascism is just a violent method of doing it. So the two are not all that different. And the two parties of the two American parties, I think Democrats are closer to fascism, in my opinion, than the Republican Party, but they're both bad. So I don't have, so one question is, if Lenin described 216 when he wrote his book, Imperialism, the highest stage, and now I agree with you, we are again in imperialist stage. What was the stage in between? So I have my own thinking on it, but I wanted your take on it. Why? So what is new in the new stage of capitalism? Since it's monopolies, imperialism is the high stage in economic sense of capitalism. How do you see it? The second thing is about this, what is the opposite of fetish, purity fetish, which is, okay, so it's left-wing communism, an infantile disorder, according to Lenin. Trotskyism is something else. It's on the surface left-wing, in substance right. So Trotskyism, I disregard. But those who are sincerely leftist communists, those are the ones who Lenin described as an infantile thing. But then there is also opportunism. Means anything goes under socialism. That is also not true. So how do you see these two? And can 3 generations of capitalist development in China still lead to socialism? In other words, how do you see transitioning? Because if that is socialism, with 80% of the workers under exploitative condition where a private capitalist takes advantage of their surplus labor, if you call that socialism, then why should workers in the United States go for socialism?
Thank you very much. I'm going to try, perhaps I'll tackle the last one you just asked first, simply because the raising of the living standards globally has been led by China. Workers today in China are living, tenfold times as better lives than their parents were, while in the US, working class people, especially the younger generations, are about to experience for the first time in history a decline in living standard in relationship to their parents. At least for me, any potential of owning a home is a pipe dream in this country. But in China, 90-something% of people own their homes. They have other securities that we don't have here. Yes, the working class is still exploited, and that surplus that's extracted sometimes by private companies, sometimes by state-owned companies, it's not used in ways in which the surplus that's extracted from workers here is used. It's reinvested back into society, into social programs, into developing new cities. Yes, there is, of course, private enterprise. There's capitalists, they call it the new class. I don't know if I'd go that far. I just consider them, there's capitalists. But capitalism is, it's controlled there by the Communist Party, so that it's not the interest of the people and labor that serves capital, but it's how can capital, especially in a globalized economy, be used to serve the interests of the people and labor. And the only way to do that, I think, is guided by a strong Communist Party that has its commitments to socialism. And they're very self-critical, extremely self-critical about their positions, their developments, how can they do things better. And you have to be self-critical in order to improve. And there's been times where perhaps it'd be harder to make the argument that in China what they're actually constructing is socialism. The wild 90s were, as they call them, the wild 90s. They were wild. You had nets outside of factories so that working people wouldn't jump off. You had in the early 2000s, Roland Bohr tells stories of being able to ask party members about Marxism, and they just have no clue. There's just opportunists. But a lot of that has changed since Xi Jinping got into office. It's promoted Marxist theory. It's promoted certain developments, which I think even the people that were skeptical about China have seen as very, very favorable. And the difference is that I view that as a trajectory. I don't think there's any breaks, whether in 68 from the previous period, 78 from the previous period, or Xi Jinping from the previous periods. I think these are trajectories of a party that that still sustains its dominance, and it's the embodiment, I think, of the interests of the vast majority of working people in China, and that has, I think, very demonstrably successfully been able to use capitalism, control it, and regulate it in such ways that it serves the interests of the people. There's things, of course, that I disagree with. There's objective contradictions which they recognize, but I think that they're resolving them. And at least for me, China is playing the same role in connection to the global struggle for socialism as, for many people in previous generations, the Soviet Union played. I wish it was perhaps a little bit more active in its anti-imperialism as the Soviet Union was. As a Cuban American, I would love to see the relations between China and Cuba resemble more of those between the USSR and Cuba, where the USSR wouldn't allow Cuba to have some of the difficulties that the blockade has imposed on it. But it's not perfect, and they're working out their contradictions. And I think it's today the beacon of the struggle against imperialism, the US NATO-led imperialist order, and making tremendous advancements in the struggle for socialism that we should, I think, learn from. Marx, as I mentioned in the presentation, and as I point out in the book, I have a whole chapter on China. Marx didn't say, okay, these are the specific forms of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now let's measure the real movement of history in accordance with these forms. No, he studied the real movement, and when the Paris Commune came around, his main question was what determinate forms can I learn from what the dictatorship of the proletariat has taken in this example? And it's wrong to take that example or maybe other social experiments conclusions and say, well, this is it. Now, what else in the world looks like this? Each place is going to take different routes. And I think the route that China has taken has been one of emphasizing the four modernizations: science, technology, productive forces, agriculture, security. And I think that's been tremendously positive in not just their socialist developments, but in the struggle against socialism, against imperialism, I mean. You mentioned the category of neo-imperialism. I do think that that there's been a development specifically after World War II of a new stage of imperialism. If imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, perhaps we can speak as Cheng Yinfu does, one of the directors of the Chinese Academy for Social Sciences. He speaks of neo-imperialism. And I think neo-imperialism is correctly describable as a stage of imperialism itself. And it's marked by an even fuller financialization of the economy, globalization of financial institutions in ways in which they were simply international when Lenin was talking about it. There was no such thing as the IMF or the World Bank in Lenin's time, as these institutions developed after World War II, and they changed the dynamics. We also have the technological revolution to think about. And I think, to be faithful to that Marxist-Leninist analysis of imperialism is not to stay fixated on some of the conclusions, but to look at the method of analysis, the worldview that allows him to get to these conclusions and to see in our world what things have developed. And things like, global dollar hegemony, which is now falling apart, right? All of those things are new developments that we should be analyzing. And now, as we're on the back end of them with a resurfacing multipolar world, we should also analyze both the demise, but also what new forms of global intercourse are coming about. And I've described it, I describe it in the book as the emergence of a post-Columbian era, in the sense that for the first time since 1492, the global centers of power are moving away from Anglo-European, the Anglo-European West, and towards the East. In some cases towards socialist countries, in other cases towards countries that have their own sort of mixed economies that have some elements of capitalism, some elements of some other stuff, some state-owned, relatively large state-owned corporations and state intervention in the economy, but that don't consider themselves socialists or capitalists, such as Iran. And there's many other countries that have a similar character. So I think we should develop Lenin's analysis. I like the developments brought about by the Chinese scholars, talking about it in terms of neo-imperialism, the new developments in the globalization of finance capital, and its extending to areas that I think have gone so far, have quantitatively accumulated to such an extent that it provides the justification for speaking about it in qualitatively different terms, or partially qualitatively different terms. So yeah, but
If
sorry.
the moderator would allow me, I just want to just clarify this thing. What my thinking is a little different on this than the scholar from China that you mentioned. My thinking is, just for food for thought here, is that what brought that, yes, Lenin was right, and that stage of capitalism had reached that moribund stage, but the two world wars made it reduce in its essence, because in its economic essence. And then after the Second World War, the United States became the workshop of the world. So profit rates were restored, and that lasted for about 20 years, for about 45 to 65. By that time, new centers developed, and Goodell's also said that in the last thing. I agree with him on that. So what has happened is it's re-reached the apex again, and this time there is equally large Chinese capital accumulated along with Western capital. And these two capitals together have this contradiction, which is why this tense situation is developing. I'm not saying China is imperialist in the sense Western capitalism, but capital is capital, whether run by a party, a communist party or a capitalist party, it is mode of production and accumulation and its contradiction that actually assert themselves. You cannot, as a human being, you can do some policies and things, but ultimately you can't go against it. You either have to overthrow or you kind of go along with it. So just comments on that, if you care to quickly, and then I will leave you alone on that.
Yeah, I'll reply quickly because I kind of ranted with the last response, but I agree that there's something that happens. I place it differently. I place it in the 70s with the development of what people have called neoliberalism. I think we shouldn't undermine the role of the crisis of the 70s and the real fork in the road that was presented to the most advanced capitalist nations, the US and the UK, amongst others, which was either you solve the contradictions of capital through going to socialism, or this tendency of the rate of profit to fall that had gotten to an absurd level can be solved through speculation, financialization, and this other route. And they took the route of exporting productive industries abroad, and what's done inside being just full financialization and profit on the basis of financial speculation, assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is largely, it played the role of it was dying, and it's like, I think it's epinephrine. I don't know the medical term, but Radhika Desai in her recent book, Capitalism, War, and the COVID pandemic, which I had the opportunity to give an endorsement for, she describes it in terms of a life extension. And now what we're dealing with is the death of that which extended temporarily the life of a moribund system. And those contradictions are rooted in the contradictions that Marx had already analyzed, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. People love talking about financialization as if it's a separate thing, but no, it's rooted in this tendency of capitalism. And it was a life boost that now we're seeing the end of that life boost. And I think it's signifying the emergence of an era where the ruling class is not able to rule in the old way. And the developments we're seeing in the American people show that the people are not willing to live in the old way either. And I think we're seeing that in Europe as well, and in France and in various other countries in England. So yeah, I do agree. We have to update that analysis and see how what was once moribund got a little boost and has now become moribund again.
Thank you.
Janet, thank you for your patience. Go ahead and unmute, followed by Eric, Sharon, and then Lavender.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your interesting and informative presentation. I see the two-party duopoly as intertwined in American capitalism, that they will not be allowed to be taken down. And any third party or candidate who runs within either of those two parties who doesn't follow the party line will be silenced, like Bernie Sanders or RFK Jr. In any case, and Cornell West will be too, probably. That said, back to the topic here. I'm curious how you see identity politics factoring into the purity fetish, and as well as the divisiveness of labels, especially the use of the term fascism, like calling all Trump supporters fascists, or just other ways that labels are being used to divide, to me. Anyway, that's what I'd like you to address.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I agree. I think in terms of the Cornell West comment, I know that they're gonna come at them with everything, and that breaking through the duopoly is at least from our standpoint seemingly impossible in the horizon. Maybe other things change. We don't have a magic 8-ball for what's going to happen tomorrow and the day after. But I think even if that does happen, it's going to make something very clear to the people that were involved, which is that what they conceived of as the limits of the Bernie campaign were not the actual limits. Many people were disillusioned by the Bernie campaign, and they said, oh, if only it was done outside of the Democratic Party through a third party. And I think that a similar enlightenment will arise if Cornell fails, which is, no, there's something deeper than just running outside of the party duopoly. We're talking about a dictatorship of capital, and the solution is going to have to be a hell of a lot more radical than just a third party presidential victory. So I think if it succeeds, it's a positive, and even if it fails, it's also a positive. as far as the labels and identity politics, it's a tricky question because they use the language of concern for marginalized groups and oppressed groups, and that hits at sentiments that us on the left have always upheld, right? We've always have, I shouldn't say always, but it's been archetypical of specifically the Marxist-Leninist left to concern itself for the questions of national liberation struggles, struggles against racism, not as separate identity struggles, but as determinate forms of class struggles. And here I would definitely recommend Domenico Losordo's book. It's called Class Struggles, where he plays on that line from the manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. It's struggles in plural for a reason. It's not just one specific form of struggle between producers and owners. It takes various determinate forms, and the same analysis of universal particular that I give for the construction of socialism in a specific nation, it always has to take a determinate form. Class struggles also take a determinate form. And in the US, struggle against racism has been one of the central forms the class struggle has taken. And that's very clearly seen in the Second American Revolution, the Civil War, which if we follow the analysis of Du Bois, we see that it created for a very brief period of time a dictatorship of labor in the South. We're always giving seminars on the Paris Commune, and that's great. We should learn from the Commune, but we had our own commune. We had our own dictatorship of the proletariat that lasted longer than the Paris Commune, and whose fall with the counter-revolution of property, as Du Bois labels it, was, I think, much more influential than the overthrow of the Paris Commune. So the thing about identity politics is that it's not in divorcing these identities from the class struggle, not only is it unable to function as an emancipatory, universal emancipatory project, but it's also unable to actually emancipate the identities that it claims to represent, because their emancipation is not tied to having 15% of the bourgeoisie be Black and 15% of the media pundits be Black. That's not emancipation. Emancipation is lifting these masses out of the exploitation and oppression that they suffer under the dominant order. It's a universal emancipation tied to the struggle of the working class for political power. The people that have addressed in our history the questions of race, of sex, of gender, of national struggles, within the Marxist tradition, specifically the Marxist-Leninist tradition, have always done so, seeing these as forms of class struggles and connected to the general struggle of labor against capital. Identity politics uses some of the rhetoric, but loses the substance of the class struggle. And insofar as it does that, I think it functions, and their theorists end up functioning as what I call controlled forms of counter-hegemony, what Gabriel Rockhill calls radical recuperators, right? They get people who are discontented with the existing order and they bring it into a fold that is essentially pro-imperialist and pro-capitalism. That doesn't mean that we should ignore the struggle against racism or the struggle against sexism, et cetera, but that we should see those as class struggles connected to the general struggle against capitalism and imperialism. And we have to critique, connected to the phenomenon of identity politics, we have to critique Wokism. Some people are uncomfortable with the term Wokism. They prefer woke washing. They want to hold on to the understanding of the word woke that comes out of the Black community. That's fine. Those are terminological differences, not conceptual ones. I think in essence, Wokism represents this new mode that the liberal wing of the capitalist, imperialist, and maybe we can even say fascistic ruling class, this new mode that they take at proliferating not just capitalism through woke capitalism, but imperialism, which is appeal to the Uyghur minorities in China as a way to legitimize the attacks on China, appeal to Maduro's imperfect policies with the LGBT community as a way to discredit Venezuela and delegitimize their socialist construction, and get general appeal from people who consider themselves left, their consent in the war, hybrid warfare waged against Venezuela. With regards to Cuba, the events of July 2021, which we followed very closely, what was the rhetoric that was coming out of the liberal left-wing woke bourgeois media? It was, they're suppressing Black artists. That narrative is always tie it to a minority so that it gets at the sentiments of people who have spent their whole lives fighting for the advancement of the rights of minorities. And in so doing it, you could use, this mixture of atrocity propaganda and sentimentality to have people consent to imperialism. And with Cuba, they're suppressing Black artists. Well, those Black artists were funded by the Net and USAID, and when they come to Florida, they meet with Trump and DeSantis, and it's like, what are you talking about? And how are they being suppressed? They're like running around doing other US State Department bullshit freely. They're not like being arrested or anything. Only the people that are actively plotting in ways that break the laws are the ones that are being arrested. So, but either way, it plays an important role in legitimizing the dominant order through appealing to these more liberal woke values and to the symbols of what was once and perhaps can still be the form that the class struggle took in these areas of fighting against racism, sexism, etc. If we don't critique that, or if we're afraid that, well, if we critique wokeism, they're going to lump us with DeSantis and these other idiots in the Republican Party, we're going to be one-sided in our war of positions, in our ideological warfare against the capitalists, because that's not only one of the forms that their hegemony takes, but I think the most dominant one, especially amongst younger peoples that are attuned to the difficulties of racial minorities, gender minorities, et cetera, right? So we do have to critique that. And maybe just real quick, in terms of labels, I do have one short section in the book where I talk about prophilicity and the role of identity construction in the left. And I don't want to go too deep into it now because I'm already ranting as a reply to this question, but a phenomenon you see online quite often is people who base their whole identity, who it is that they are, with what they put online, what they put on their Twitter, on their Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. And that profile is in many ways undivisible from who they are as a person, right? They consider the success of their profile intimately related to who they are as a person. And they end up putting these symbols, the hammer and sickle, or if they're democratic socialists, the democratic socialist rose, on their social media biographies. And what they post is tied to who they are as a person. And when you have that as the case, that means that their identity is tied to being a countercultural fringe group of radicals within capitalism, which means that socialism actually winning is something that means that their identity is destroyed. It's a loss of selfhood. And in many ways, I think that this is one of the mechanisms through which people who claim to be attached to projects for the advancement of socialism aren't actually substantially attached to that, because that would mean a loss of selfhood. And it ends up making socialism really just these a lot of people who call themselves socialists and communists, really they just end up participating in insular groups that allow them to sustain their identity as countercultural agents within capitalism without actually fighting to create anything new.
And they get funding too.
Right.
Can I just follow up with a couple of quick things? About the two-party duopoly. There was also Jill Stein's run in 2016, and what happened?
I voted for her in 2016.
Yeah, so did I. So third party. And then could you comment on the African People's Socialist Party and what's going on with that?
Yes, we had Noah, who I've mentioned, Eddie, who has been on ICSS before, and we recently wrote a piece on the US's violations of the First Amendment for various groups and the role of censorship in our era, so the censorship of dissenting attitudes. And we bring up the issue of the African People's Socialist Party and the just absurd accusations of this group being tied in any way, shape, or form to the Russian government. It's a group of Black socialists who, frankly, and there's quite a few issues that I disagree with them on, but I don't care. They're being attacked for saying the truth about the US's proxy war against Russia. And I think not just everyone on the left, but everyone that has any amount of respect for some of the constitutional rights that we're supposed to have should be fighting against the indictment of the African People's Socialist Party, their 4 leaders, and the attacks that the Uhuru movement have been facing. And we connected that to a general attack on the freedom of speech and media, the archetypical cases of Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, of course, which are the ones that are most recognized. But our institute has also received censorship. We've had accounts with close to 500,000 followers on the most popular app in the country, TikTok, banned. After they were banned, we've been able to find out through leaks that the people that were doing content moderation, deciding what content stays up and what doesn't, were largely agents, State Department agents that were within TikTok, and people from these non-governmental organizations that are really the wing of the CIA and the State Department. So the content moderation has been one where neoliberalism and the lies that are proliferated in the media are accepted, and then the people that say the truth are banned. And the best example is our covers on the Nord Stream bombing. From the beginning of it happening, we felt that it was clear to anyone that it was done by the US, that there's no reason for Russia to blow up its own pipeline. But neoliberal content creators that were saying that Russia blew up their own pipeline and claiming that we were Putinist for saying that that wasn't the case, their videos got millions and millions of views. Our videos got banned and our accounts got banned. And not only that, our Eddie, who is the key person when it comes to that part of the Institute, the short video content, he got fired from his job because of that. We've had other Institute contributors that have done, for instance, Kayla Popichet, who's a militant member of our Institute and who was doing a series called Debunking Ukrainian Nationalism, where it was debunking the lies that are fed to Ukrainian youth about their national path, which is, it's mythical. It's aimed at divorcing them from any historical connections to Russia and propelling this nationalist and neo-Nazi narrative. Her videos led her to getting fired from her job, to getting death threats, to being put on the Ukrainian kill list. So we brought this up recently in an article. So I think that those attacks against the African People's Socialist Party should be fought against in the same way that all these other different forms of attacks on media and free speech should also be fought against.
Okay, Eric, thank you for your patience. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question, followed by Sharon Lavender.
Hi. My question was essentially the same as the previous one, except I'd like to get comments on, you kind of hinted at this when you talked about colonial settler kind of thing. That's the phrase that academics now use to describe U.S. history, development, whatever. So I wanted your comment on how this kind of woke terminology and culture is seems to be very deeply embedded in academia at the university level, but also now at high school, grade school level, where the controversy about how children should be taught about sexuality is a big deal. So yeah, that and then so actually now I want to put it specifically. What I'm thinking is that the left has to do more, has to actually give a positive statement of their views on the woman question, the LGBTQ question, the question of racism. So things like, what is a woman? I mean, I think, that needs to be answered. And it's fraught, it's a loaded question, but needs to be answered. Things like reparations. What is the US left attitude towards reparation as a solution or as a response to racism? And then finally, I know that Cuba has grappled with the Cuban communists have grappled with these questions over many years and have come to some conclusions. So, I mean, I know that, in Cuba, the woman question is raised to the highest level. The question of racism has been addressed at a very high level. And also the LGBTQ question has been recently been raised in importance. So they have like a whole month or whatever. Anyway, so comment on what Cuba has come to feel about these issues, and especially about, just one other thing. You kind of hinted, like, when talking about class struggle, it's like, oh, these other things are just ways to divide us and keep us from class struggle. I think that's a very, not sure that that's what you were really saying, but if it is, I think it's a lame kind of explanation, and it's roundly rejected by people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who tries to oppose, class struggle and struggle against racism, etc. So so that's it. It's a lot there, but
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I think first off, you start by mentioning. Oh. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. We had a little echo for a second. I don't know if you were on speaker.
No, I think Alvin might have
Okay.
came in and echoed.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it's a loaded question, and I think you're right to point out that a lot of these things stem from academia, and that's important to bring up because I've often found myself in discussions with elder comrades, and they ask me, well, why do you pay so much attention to criticizing these tendencies from academia, whether it's postmodernism, post-colonialism, post-Marxism, post-humanism, if they're just academic trends? And the reality is that they're not. The academies are the most advanced form of producing ideological coherence for new forms of bourgeois thought, and those forms themselves then ripple into culture through NGOs and through the media and other forms. So it's important to address the question of how it is that bourgeois ideological developments in the academy then manifest themselves across civil society, and how can we critique them not in the more incoherent forms in which you find them in civil society, but in the most advanced expression that they take in the academy. And I think that here the work of Gabriel Rockhill, the work recently of John Bellamy Foster in extending the analysis of Georg Lukács with the one he provides in The Destruction of Reason, and thinking about bourgeois philosophy as rooted in a certain form of irrationalism. Foster has recently extended that to the epoch that Lukács was not able to see, to the development of postmodernism, post-Marxism, etc. All the posts, they always start with post something. So I think that's important, and it plays a relatively large role in the war of positions, which is the one that we are primarily engaged in right now, because we don't have the conditions to wage a direct war of maneuver, a direct frontal attack on the bourgeoisie. We're still at a stage in our struggle where we have to change minds, convince people, and participate in ideological warfare. As regards to these other questions, I think the bourgeois tendency is to divide those from class struggle, right? To divide the question of racism or the women's question from the struggle of labor against capital. And we should definitely push back against that. And it's not that like representation is bad. Like you know, there's these people getting mad at that, you know, the recent, is it the recent movie where they have a black Ariel? What's the name of the Disney movie? Does anyone remember? It's not Cinderella. It's so with the mermaid.
Little Mermaid.
The Little Mermaid. How can I remember Mermaid and not the Little Mermaid? Right now, the Little Mermaid is black. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think we should have problems with, you know, with that sort of thing. We should have problems with the people who say that's emancipation, right? That's what we should have problems with, because representation is you know, it's good, but when it's substantiated by actual advancements in the mass of people that are part of the working class that are in these groups. So, for instance, Nicaragua and Cuba. Nicaragua has a law that at least half of their representatives have to be women. I think that's a very positive form of empowerment of women. In Cuba, the vast majority of professionals and politicians and people holding high offices are women. And in terms of the race dynamic of the racial breakdown of the country, there's an overwhelming, the percentage of minorities that are in positions of power are greater than, you know, their representation in the population at large. I think that's positive, because it's backed up by the substantial uplifting of these groups, not just as separate groups, but as part of the working masses. And I think that's the critique that we should be bringing forward to these people that say emancipation is just, you know, putting X, Y, or Z identity on our screens, or, you know, diversifying the amount of billionaires that we have in accordance to race, gender, sexual preferences, et cetera, et cetera. So we definitely do have to critique that and not go to, you know, critique that while we also critique, you know, some of the people on the right that are just performing a mirror of that. Both of these two things are connected. And the phrase that I've often used is that in a way we have to be both against Wokism and against anti-Wokism, as it appears in certain parts of the Republican Party. So that's somewhat of a dialectical conclusion. It's a reject a both and, but a rejection of both and.
Okay, next is Sharon, followed by Lavender, followed by Sheila. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We're going towards the end. So please go ahead and ask your question, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment and then a question. So I absolutely agree, and I thank you for raising up the fetish of purity is really a bad thing for us. The example that I think of at the current moment is people give lip service or talk about the need for a united front, but I think very few actually understand what that means. Because if you're going to have a united front, you have to unite with everyone who can possibly be united on a particular issue. For example, that the US is waging a proxy war in the Ukraine. Well, but then I come up against many leftists who say, oh, we could never support what the libertarians are doing or have done with regard to that because they're so terrible in so many ways. Well, they're actually very good on that one issue. And so the whole purity thing gets in the way of being able to fight back. And if it's true that we're saying that fascism is on the rise, not just in one party, then a united front against fascism will take many forms, but you have to be willing to be open to it and not and put away your feelings that, oh, we're somehow relating to impure organizations or people or something. So thank you for that. My question, I know I heard you say that your friend has won over many co-workers to the idea of communism, but they could never think of bringing those people to a Communist Party meeting because they'd be so turned off. And I would like to know more about what that means, because clearly Communist Party meetings should not turn off ordinary working people. However, I have been in meetings in the left where people come and they say, oh, this is too abstract. This discussion is too abstract for me. And I reject that notion of something being too abstract. If we are going to solve the problem of how humanity can liberate itself, we have to speak in abstractions. We have to be, and we have to teach people why those abstractions are important and how they themselves can think in those terms, because it's not that hard. Certain intellectuals may put down people who don't come with that skill, and that's a bad thing. But we should be able to teach that skill to everyone everyone in the working class.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. To comment on the first thing, I think you were hinting at a dilemma that we addressed when the Rage Against the War Machine rally took place in February 19, and we condemned the rejection of the left of the rally as a form of purity fetish, right? Because it makes it seem as one is contaminated by association with these people, when in this area there's agreement. And if there's agreement in that area, there's nothing easier than to show how imperialism is connected to capitalism as a specific, as capitalism in a specific stage. So if they're against war, it's extremely easy to show them how that's rooted in capitalism. So I definitely do agree. And the way we approached it, we supported that Rage Against the War Machine rally. And then when the following month, the people who had rejected it did their own rally, we also endorsed that one, right? You know, and I think both of them had around the same turnout. So obviously something has to be done so that there's more than a few thousand people in the streets fighting against a proxy war that statistically more than half Americans are already against. So thank you very much for bringing that up. They also treat it as if you're, you know, bringing these people into a party, and as if they're going to ideologically destroy the coherence of the Marxist outlook, when it has nothing to do with that. It's just a united front on a specific issue. As far as the comments that I referenced, Noah and the party, I don't know if many of you have had the chance to see this, but the 2019 Socialism conference that was hosted by DSA, there's videos that have been going around for a very long time. The right has used it to mock the left, but it's videos of like, you know, if people don't say the right, if someone like got up and said, guys, you know, you're talking too much and you don't let me hear the speaker. And then someone else got up and said, how can you use that non-gender neutral language? And then someone else got up and said, can everyone stop talking as soon as everyone started? It's that sort of activity that's all tied to this hyper woke, hyper identitarian form of politics that's rooted in the academy, the NGOs, and the media, and that trickles down because of the PMC class position of members within socialist organizations. It trickles down into organizing. And that sort of activity, what are we reading? Well, we're going to read Angela Davis, Our Prisons Obsolete. Really? Is that the first thing you should be reading when you bring someone into the communist movement? Like, yeah, it's a great book. It does a great job at connecting the institutions of racism from slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, and prisons. And it's a good book. But if you're bringing someone to communism, I think that, I don't know, there's some classics that we should go through first and not hyper-focus it on certain more identitarian ways of interpreting those sorts of things. So that sort of stuff. And the paradox is, and this is something that Noah mentions, like they end up asking themselves, how is it that in this part of the country that's primarily Black, there's no Black people in their organizations? It's because they try to force it, and they try to address issues in a very woke way that's not appealing to the vast majority of working class people, even the ones that they claim to be, you know, super in favor for in a very romanticized and often patronizing manner. You know, we just started the Midwestern Marx classes. We've been running a Basics of Marxism class. We have 30 students. It'll be hard to find 3 people that have a similar background. Different ages, different races, different ethnic backgrounds, different countries, different sexual, a completely different group, all united by the idea that it's a very bleak future that we have ahead of us if capitalist imperialism continues the route it's going, and that we have to fight against it. We have never tried to see, okay, how can we, okay, we're going to limit this person so that this person because of their identity. No, it's been an organic, diverse movement because our class is diverse. And when you approach class issues as class issues, you're going to get that diversity. But you don't find that in these meetings. And that's part of what Noah meant by not being able to take working people there. It ends up having socialist meetings resemble to them the human resource and diversity, equity, and inclusion meetings that they have to deal with from their managerial class within their place of employment. And that is alienating to the working class.
Okay, Lavender, thank you for your patience. You've been waiting a really long time. Go ahead and unmute yourself. And we'll try to get one more in. We're already over, and the planning committee is going to fire me if I go on much longer. So, Lavender, go ahead, please. Unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I guess something that was kind of brought up earlier was kind of monopoly capitalism, kind of how it relates to kind of like foreign interventions, and that kind of made me think of stuff like NAFTA and AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which are both kind of reaching a kind of like expiration with like, I think the African Growth and Opportunity Act not kind of like being dated to expire in like 2025, and NAFTA being replaced by the UMSCA, or the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, which introduced the Rapid Labor Response Mechanism, which grants the United States the right to intervene when Mexican workers are denied the right to collective bargaining. I guess what I wanted to kind of bring up is, if the United States has kind of never been altruistic and kind of has always kind of backed American corporative interests, why is it today interested in providing concessions, or to some extent improving conditions for like Mexican laborers, especially for like auto industrial workers specifically? How can we kind of understand these kind of like concessions that are being granted?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. I cannot help but see that connected to the fact that Manuel López Obrador and Mexico, and in his coalition is the Mexican Communist Party, friends within it that are in various positions of leadership. I cannot help but see that as the as setting the ground for a potential narrative that is critical of Mexico in such a way that it can begin to legitimize the different forms of warfare that we've seen the U.S. wage with other countries with Mexico, who, you know, they just revealed that one of its recent leaders before AMLO was basically a CIA asset. So, you know, AMLO's talking about nationalizing the lithium, of joining this new basically lithium OPEC that perhaps is going to be created by Bolivia and other lithium producing countries. So he's moving leftward in terms of nationalizing things so that they can use the resources of its country for its people. And at the same time, he's been at the forefront of defending Cuba from any sorts of attack from the empire. He was the first one to send Cuba aid. He was the first one to critique the Summit of Exclusion that was done, the Summit of the Americas, but I've been calling it the Summit of Exclusion, that excluded Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela last year. So I can't help but see that as one of the examples, in the same way that they use the Uyghurs. You know, we have to defend Uyghur minorities. The U.S. doesn't care about Muslims. We've killed 4.5 million people in the Middle East in the last 2 decades. You think they care about Muslims? They don't care. They're just using that so they can build a sentimentalist narrative for the more left-wing parts of their population to support their imperialist battles. And I think that's going to perhaps be the same phenomenon with Mexico and with regards to their auto workers. What is true is that perhaps Mexico can turn around and do it to the U.S. because they've denied the right of the rail workers to collectively bargain for a contract that they would endorse, and they have legalized their right to strike, which is an essential method in the process of collective bargaining and fighting for their rights. So the U.S. is no friend of upholding the rights of workers to collective bargaining.
Okay, last question is Sheila, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. This is really a fascinating program. You know, a lot of the things that we've been discussing about the left and the center happens on the radio. I don't know if you've ever heard of Pacifica or spoken on any of Pacifica's 5 radio stations, but all of these political struggles come head to head on the air, and there is a struggle for control over the airwaves. Notably, the people here probably listen, hopefully, maybe, to KPFA, where they've just introduced at 5 o'clock in the morning for 5 days a week, a character named Ian Masters, who thinks Mumia Abu-Jamal is guilty and had some cop on to back his theory. He supports Israel. He hates Cuba, he hates Venezuela, on and on. But he's been given this forum on Pacifica. There's a lot of us who are opposed to that. And there's, he was on KPFK, but now he's been brought onto KPFA. Yeah. So we're having a town hall this coming Saturday, which I would love it if everybody would come to it. It's, I guess, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, California time. And one of our speakers is going to be from the African People's Socialist Party. In addition, we'll have somebody from SDS from Florida, St. Petersburg, Tampa. The Tampa 5 is a group of students who were attacked by campus police for demanding more Black enrollment and, you know, protesting all the reactionary moves against people of color education and LGBT education, et cetera, et cetera. So they're going to be on, and with an eye to grounding this in the working class, we're also having a speaker, Chris Silvera from the Teamsters Local 808 in New York City. So, and you can find this online if you just do a search for Pacifica Fight Back. And we're also going to have speakers from all 5 stations, because Pacifica is just about to launch into elections for control of the local boards of the 5 stations. So I urge people who are Marxists, who are anti-racist, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist to run for the boards, and who like to work, to run for these boards, to guarantee the left a voice on the radio, because there's you know, the Democratic Party is, they're not stupid, the CIA is not stupid, they're aiming to control this huge media network, even though we're in debt. But my question for our guest of honor is, you know, all around the world, you see indigenous peoples in the forefront of the struggles around the environment and for their human rights and for land. And some of them are Marxists, but most of them are not, and do not particularly even see the need for Marx. Now, and yet they're in the lead. They are actually doing the work, laying their lives on the front lines. So my question is about Hegel. I know that Marx studied Hegel. I know that Du Bois studied Hegel, that Fanon studied Hegel, and you have studied Hegel. The question is, was Hegel necessary for Marxism? And is Hegel necessary today?
If you could answer that in about 10 seconds, Carlos, that would be great.
Absolutely. Hegel is the person that systematizes the dialectical worldview in as comprehensive a fashion as possible. And although it has a deeply rooted ontological idealism, it's in many other ways, as Lenin would say, the germ of dialectical and historical materialism. Because if you look at his philosophy of history, there's flirtations with things that are a way of describing history that Marxists would. So yeah, I think Hegel is necessary to understand, and I agree very much with the sentiment that Lenin gives in his philosophical notebooks, where he says that to properly understand Marx's Capital, especially its first few chapters, we must understand Hegel's Science of Logic. And that doesn't mean you have to go through this 800-page text that's very hard to read and understand every part of it, but that you should understand the method and the logic behind the movements and the various moments, because it's a similar one that you see in Capital, and it's a similar one that's at the foundation of dialectical materialism, which is Marxism, basically.
Carlos, can you please tell everybody how they can watch Midwestern Marx?
Yes, we are on pretty much
how to follow you.
Yes, we are pretty much everywhere on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and in every place with the exception of Twitter. Our handle is just Midwestern Marx, and on Twitter it's Marx Midwest, because the Midwestern Marx handle someone had it when we created our account. You can also find our more from our institute at our website, midwesternmarx.com. You can find our books at midwesternmarx.com/books. You'll also find our Journal of American Socialist Studies there. And yeah, we do on our YouTube page and Facebook and Twitch, we do about 4 to 5 streams a week where we spend 3 hours discussing news, theory, reacting to videos, and doing all sorts of different things and talking with the audience, because it's a live stream. So you can tune into those. They're usually around 9 p.m. Central Time, or in the morning at noon Central, when Eddie does his on Tuesdays and Saturdays, I think. So yeah.
And if you would you put
Carlos,
your email address in the chat?
My email address?
In the chat?
Yes.
Thank you.
Carlos, thank you very much for coming back. We look forward to having you back again. Let's keep cooperating. Let's get the Midwest and the West Coast, East Coast, Texas, everywhere around the world. We're all working for the same cause. So thank you so much for coming by. There was a lot of questions, a lot of real substance here in the discussion today. Thank you so much for presenting and sharing your time with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. And if you all can and would like to leave a favorable review or a star, the stars on Amazon, that would be very helpful, because the book, as you can imagine, attacks quite a few people that are not happy with those attacks, and they go back and then they give a 1-star review or something. So if you want to help and leave a review, you can. So thank you.
Where is that?
Amazon.
On Amazon.
Yeah.
I mean,
Amazon.
just put it in Amazon in my address line and there.
No. You have to go to the book, his book, and
thank
then
you.
under the
Okay,
review.
okay.
review.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. And Alan, do I have everybody's permission to close the session?
I think you better do it.
Okay. All right. It was so exciting. Thank you, Carlos.
No.
Carlos.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye.
See you another time.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel-Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel-Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.